in memory of Reverend Francis Vernon Douglas, whose sense of duty and glorious death is thus commemorated by the people of Taranaki, in whose midst he first lived and worked as a priest before joining St. Columban's Missionary Society, whose sense of duty and glorious death. All was going well for Father Douglas as a Columban missionary in the small village of Pelilea in the Philippines until the Japanese invaded in 1941. Father Douglas himself was endangered since the guerrillas would occasionally come down from the surrounding hills for mass or confession. But the wrath of the Japanese against the guerrillas was mounting. Men from the villages were rounded up, kept without food and beaten, and doubtless supplied information as to those hiding places. He found himself surrounded by hostile Japanese soldiers. He was taken to the church at Paiti and subjected to the terrible water torture. Finally, bleeding from a wound in his head, was brought out and bound to a post supporting the choir loft. He was last seen conscious but in a dying condition. Such was his end, a fine, virile young man of 33, now a broken, bleeding victim.
He just kept in the background, he never drew attention to himself at all. He was one of those, he never drew attention to himself. And he was always very peaceful and happy, and loved sport of every kind of sport. He was always the captain of anything. He'd never be ashamed of anything. He had a marvellous sense of irony. He always he always got the better of everybody. Really he did, but I'm afraid he got caught in the end, didn't he?
A natural leader, Vernon would stick up for the underdog if need be. One schoolteacher commented that he was a good kid, but tough and untidy. A working-class family of 10, the Douglases may have been poor with no shoes or secondary education, but under their mother's supervision, theirs was a Christian household. But at age 16, Vernon, following in his brother's footsteps, made the big decision to enter the seminary, where he studied hard for 8 years to become a parish priest. It was during this time that an incident occurred that would eventually lead Vernon down a much more adventurous path. He heard a talk on the work of missionary priests in China and the Philippines, and would secretly harbor the desire to become a missionary priest himself. In 1935, just 4 months after Vernon was ordained as a priest, he wrote this letter to the St. Columban's Mission. I feel that God may be calling me to the foreign missions in China. I'm not writing on sudden impulse, for I have been considering the question for some 2 or 3 years. I think my one great motive is to save some of the millions of souls in China, to save them for Christ. And Father Douglas was accepted by the St. Columban's Mission and completed the 1-year training in Melbourne. Then he returned home to officiate at his sister's wedding. He also had to say goodbye before he was posted overseas. It was to be his final visit, and for Catherine, his mother, the farewell was full of foreboding.
Vern said to her, I'll give you my final blessing, Mum. And she took his hands and she kept holding them, and she said, oh, Vern, she said, I'll never see you again, I'll never see you again. And Vern said, for goodness sake, Patty, take Mum away. He just got out the door as quickly as he could.
Instead of being posted to China as he had expected, Vernon was sent to the Philippines. After the bombing of Pearl Harbor in 1941, the Japanese took over the Philippines. Within 2 years, the Japanese military police would be watching Father Francis Vernon Douglas's every step. He was about to face the toughest test of his life.
He was remembered very warmly. One lady said to me that they always remembered the day he died with a special mass. Others said they thought of him as a film star. He was so handsome and good-looking and had such a beautiful voice that they thought he was a star from Hollywood.
Pat's big breakthrough came when she managed to track down an eyewitness. He was Colonel Frank Quisada, who'd been a Filipino guerrilla officer during the Japanese occupation. Colonel Quisada had been imprisoned with Father Douglas and witnessed much of his torture. Why did the Japanese arrest Father Douglas?
The most incriminating thing that happened to him was 3 days before he was arrested, that he got this call to go up to the guerrilla hideout in the mountains, and he went believing it was a sick call. But it wasn't a sick call, it was just 3 lonely GIs wanting a bit of European company. And he was really cross when he got back, and he told the other Columban priests that he would like to be interned because he felt his life was in jeopardy.
In August 1942, the guerrillas successfully blew up a Japanese convoy near Pelilla, and the Japanese became ruthless in their efforts to find out who had helped. One of their techniques was known as zoning. A cordon would be thrown around the village, and all the men and teenage boys found within that zone would be herded into the village church and systematically tortured. After Father Douglas returned from seeing the 3 American GIs, he was visited by the Japanese military police, who found several items in his study which they considered suspicious. Broken radio, some Boy Scout flags, and a National Geographic map which Father Douglas used to follow the progress of the war. It was these items which the Japanese used as evidence that he was a spy. He was taken to the nearby village of Piety, and there left all day in the heat of the sun. Another missionary priest, Father Walsh, told the War Crimes Tribunal that he heard a Japanese soldier tell a local Filipino policeman, "We have taken a white man. We have found him in a town very far away. When we came on him, he was reading a book. Reading and reading. He is a spy." It is from this point on that Colonel Quisada was able to give Patricia an eyewitness account of what happened. The colonel was inside the church along with 2,500 other Filipino men and youths who'd been rounded up for interrogation. He wrote a vivid description of events for Patricia and drew her a plan of the church to show where everything took place. The colonel wrote, "When Father Douglas was brought into the church, he was tied in the arms and had a swollen face. It was obvious that the Japanese had beaten him already upon capture. He was tied to the confessional railing in front of the altar, but he was allowed to hold his rosary beads." Colonel Quisada and his friend were curious about this white priest. Risking their lives, they moved close enough to whisper questions without attracting the attention of the guard. They wanted to know who he was and where he came from. The colonel then asked Father Douglas to hear his confession, which he did willingly. The priest also promised the colonel he would not break the sanctity of confession. Before long, the soldiers dragged Father Douglas to the sacristy, which was being used as the torture chamber. In here, he was subjected to what the colonel calls the water cure. The torture victim was forced to lie on a bench. His face was covered with a wet sack and water poured over it slowly to create a drowning sensation. The victim would choke helplessly, gasping for air while the guards beat his body to a pulp. The torture would continue until the victim spoke, often forced to make a false confession, unable to withstand the torture any longer. Colonel Quisada heard the muffled cries of Father Douglas, but no words. Over an hour later, he appeared, battered and wounded. He was tied again to the altar railing. Whenever he would try to lean or sit, he would be slapped and hit on the face by the Japanese guards. According to the colonel, Father Douglas encouraged the men around him in prayer. He said, "Do not be afraid. We are in the house of God. Have faith. We will be able to win over these disbelievers." Father Douglas, along with the colonel and others suspected of guerrilla activity, were denied food and sleep. After 2 nights, Father Douglas was dragged through the church to the white marble baptismal font. They made him kneel in front of a Japanese officer, and he was beaten repeatedly. Colonel Quesada could hear the interrogation being conducted through an interpreter. They wanted Father Douglas to admit to contact with the American GIs hiding in the mountains, but he wouldn't. After they'd finished with him, he was dragged away from the font and tied to a post underneath the choir loft. Patricia went to the actual church in Piety and she took these photos. This is the post that Father Douglas was tied to, and in front of him he would have faced this painting of heaven and hell. The only movement from Father Douglas was that of his lips, silently moving in prayer while his hands fingered black rosary beads. The colonel told Patricia, despite his pain and his lack of sleep, he never complained or he never showed any pain or suffering. He never shed any tears. On the 3rd day, Father Douglas, sensing his death, asked to have his last rites administered. The Japanese agreed. According to the colonel, the local villagers believed that Father Douglas was a saint sent by the Almighty to absorb pain and sacrifice on their behalf. He came from nowhere, yet he shared their punishment and their pain. Was he heaven sent? They certainly believe so. The Japanese were convinced that Father Douglas had information concerning guerrillas in the Philippines. Some of the men in his parish belonged to an organization known as the Knights of the Sacred Heart, and we now know that many of the men in that group were in fact involved in guerrilla activities.
The guerrillas in that area were mainly young men, and in those days the Catholic men would have gone regularly to confession. Confession was an important part in their life in those days, especially when you're in warfare, that it was really important that you kept in a state of grace so that if you died you went to heaven. So these men would be going to confession. The Japanese would know that, and they would know that Vernon Douglas would hear their confession.
So did Father Douglas know what the guerrillas were up to?
I think so. He was such an independent person and a strong person and had a very confident conscience that even though he was required to be neutral, that he would be doing what he could to help. He was very concerned about the war before the Japanese invaded the Philippines, and I can't believe that 18 months later his concern would be any less.
Father Douglas was thrown onto the back of a truck. The truck departed in the direction of Santa Cruz, and that was the last time that anyone ever saw him. It's presumed that he was put to death, although his body has never been found. And what happened to Colonel Quesada? He was tortured too and threatened with execution. But amazingly, his Japanese interrogator gave the order to set him free. But many others weren't so lucky. Some of the altar boys in Father Douglas's own parish were interrogated by the Japanese military police, and so were members of the parish scout troop. Many were never seen again. It's presumed that they were executed. Back in New Zealand, Father Douglas's family knew nothing of his presumed death until some 2 years later, when a letter arrived for his mother.
I said, Mum, I'll open this, Mum. I said, I think there might be something in it about Vern. She said, don't you dare open my mouth. And she snatched it from my hand. She said, no, she said, I'll open it. And of course, when she opened it right out, her face just went, oh. She just froze every time she had any bad news.
Francis Douglas died an heroic death. Many of the villagers in Piety saw him as a savior. Like Christ, he was stripped, beaten and lashed, accepting unjust treatment with great bravery. Like Christ, he was 33 years old. And for many among the Catholic Church back in New Zealand, he died a martyr's death.